At some point when playing a Pokemon game, you probably noticed that there are some strange names for various things in the English version. And while there are a couple of weird items and a dialogue line or two that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in translation, moves are probably the most notorious offender. Many Pokemon moves have names that don't quite match their description or make a lot of sense. Aerial Ace, for example, is pretty undescriptive. And moves like Assist, for example, seem to have a connection to some kind of theme that is not clearly conveyed by the name alone. Sometimes there are even just outright errors. The moves Feint Attack and Vice Grip were spelled entirely wrong for decades. But there's one move that's a bit infamous that you may have already noticed at one point or another. That being Splash. Magikarp's once signature, mostly useless move is on a lot of Pokemon now that don't really seem capable of doing much splashing. And the move itself is explicitly normal typed, something that has never changed in spite of a number of typing updates in other games. So, why is this exactly? Well, let me tell you a story. It's around 1998. Your name is Ogasawara Nobuyuki, or just Nob for short. You're starting out your career as a video game translator, having already worked on a well-regarded JRPG for the SNES. And now, you're in the depths of translating a little game that's been pretty popular in Japan over the past few years. That being Pokémon. You and your team are working through the mountains of text in this little Game Boy game, and your current task is to sort through the long list of moves that each of these little creatures can be commanded to use throughout the game. It's not a simple task. You've only got the names of the moves themselves, maybe the animations, and maybe the stats, and maybe the monsters that can use them to go off, along with whatever notes that the devs might have been kind enough to leave you. To make it even worse, the translation for a number of these moves is not exactly clear-cut. Some of these moves are weird fantasy JRPG techniques that don't have an established translation. Something like Reito Beam, being freezing beam? Some are pretty easy to translate, but won't fit into the clean 12-character limit. Kara de Hasamu is clearly squeezed with shell, but that's well over 12 characters. And some are culturally specific and would go way over the head of any 12-year-old that would end up playing this game. You can't really explain something like the Daimonji, that being the character for Big burnt into the mountainside of Kyoto every summer during the Obon Festival. And some just don't make any sense. What the fuck is a Naito Heddo? However, some of the most problematic are actually the simplest. And there's one move that's caused you quite a bit of trouble, even resulting in you getting in an argument with your boss. This move is learned by only one Pokemon, Koikingu, and does nothing. That move is, of course, Haneru. This particular word happens to have a lot of minor meanings, like reject or splash, for instance, but you would only really use those if the context made sense. However, as discussed before, you don't really have a lot to go off of. All you have is this single word, the pretend fish that uses it, and the little bouncing animation. That's it. What's worse is you're missing something that might be a lifeline in some of your other projects, that being kanji. Well, the system of Chinese characters that Japanese adopted, is the bane of Japanese learners everywhere, native and non-native. It does have one extremely useful feature. For some words with multiple meanings, you can choose between a few different kanji to disambiguate them as the writer. In this case, there are two possible spellings. This one and this one. This one tends to encapsulate the hit meanings, while this one makes it clear that you're talking about some kind of jumping. There's just one problem, though. Pokémon is a game for elementary school children, and most elementary school children know maybe a few hundred kanji, if that. For that reason, there are absolutely no kanji. This means you have a tricky choice to make with no clear answer. So how do you handle the move? Well, in your mind, the answer is pretty straightforward. It's a fish out of water. It would make sense that it would flop. You submit flop as the name of the move, but once it goes through the process, you get feedback from your editor/boss and they say that it should be Splash. Now, to be fair, Splash does make some sense. It's a fish, and it's water type to boot. It would track that a fish would splash someone with an attack. But you think your translation is stronger. Number one, the move does no damage and has no effect. And number two, it's not even water typed. Not to mention that there's no real indication of it having to do with water other than the fact that it's on a water typed Pokemon. Against your objections, however, your boss insists. Splash it is. The game ships with a subpar translation, and you move on. A few years later, you're brought back in to help translate the sequels, Gold and Silver, King, Bogin. At some point during the process, you find that your original translation was actually vindicated. A new Pokemon, which your team has named Hoppip, is a grass flying type, and looks like a cat mixed with a weed. Absolutely nothing about it is water-related or fish-like. Though now, you realize, your choice of flop might not have been that great either. Cat weeds probably don't flop, but they could easily hop. In the end, despite all the good arguments that you made, and despite your bosses' and editors' insistence, you both ended up being, quote-unquote, wrong. And 30 years later, we're still stuck with the ramifications of that quote-unquote wrong choice. So, aside from presenting some interesting trivia, why am I actually telling you this story? I think the biggest takeaway here is that translation is hard. Even a well-respected career translator like Nobu Ogasawara ended up with a quote-unquote wrong translation, in spite of a solid argument in favor of his choice, and even then, he couldn't convince the powers that be to use his option over the less fitting choice that was ultimately chosen. The fact of the matter is, even for one singular, fairly straightforward word, there was no clear-cut translation that made everyone happy. And due to the reality of translating for games, realities that have hardly changed in the last 30 or so years, translators and localizers, like Nobu Ogasawara, will always have to make difficult choices with limited information. And sometimes still be wrong. In spite of everything that they did to avoid a wrong translation, they didn't even know that it was wrong until significantly later. To help you understand how difficult this can be, let me give you an example from English. If you were given just this one word, and told to either translate it into your language, or even just give a definition for it, for those of you who are monolingual, what translation or definition would you pick? What if I also told you that it has to do with giving something? Well, in that case, most of you would probably pick the word present, like a gift. But, as a counterpoint, you also give a presentation. See how complicated this can be? But why did this even happen in the first place? Obviously, this is kind of a perfect storm. Nob was being made to translate a word with almost no context, and too many options to easily pick one. But this is made even worse by the fact that it was Japanese. Japanese is what we call a low-context language, which means that there's a tendency for speakers to just omit words with the understanding that the other person will understand the conversational context, i.e. what's going on around them and in the conversation. This extends to games as well. For example, the text that's displayed when your Pokemon uses a move in English is 3 words. Magikarp used Splash. But in Japanese, it's only 2. You get the name of the Pokemon, plus a little bit of grammar, and the name of the move. There's no need for the word used here, because you understand from context that your Pokemon is using the move. Because of this, Japanese game devs are able to develop games with this understanding that the bare minimum is usually enough, and they don't really necessarily need to give longer descriptions or context to be able to evoke the kind of imagery that they want to through text. This dearth of information makes Japanese especially tricky when learning, translating, or even just interacting with things in your day-to-day life. So ultimately, what can we learn from this humble fish and its unfortunate mistranslation? 2 things, I think. Number 1, Japanese is hard, though I'm sure that everyone watching this video probably already knew that. But number 2, and I think perhaps more importantly, is that translation is not just a simple one-to-one kind of job. In addition to the language competency, it requires broad contextual knowledge. That means you're going to have to get off the page or out of the fantasy world and look into the real world to actually understand what's going on. This is admittedly an extreme example. A lot of translation is simpler than this, but these kinds of dilemmas are way more common than you might think. This is why even in the age of AI, with things like DeepL, companies like Nintendo and the Pokemon Company still hire translators and localizers. People like me, because we're the ones keeping your Japanese games enjoyable and faithful to the original text, and also keeping them from becoming AI slop. So next time you're playing your favorite game from the Land of the Rising Sun, thank your friendly neighborhood translators and localizers for saving you the decades of time it takes to learn Japanese. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. Before you leave the video, do all those YouTube things, liking, subscribing, ringing the bell, and I guess hyping now? Anyway, this is my first actual long-form video, and I'm a little nervous about putting it up. And if you're an employer,
高揚してください。翻訳の能力は高いし、日本の文化と日本語の知識が多いし、すごく一生懸命に働くし、よろしくお願いします。
If you have any questions about Japanese language or culture, or just want me to expand on something that I've talked about here, or have any suggestions for videos that I might be able to do, leave them in the comments below. みんな、ありがとうございます。またね。